All living things are organized in special ways that help make sure their normal life activities run smoothly and efficiently, all the way from their birth to their death. Because they are very organized in structure, living things are also called organisms. Let us look at some organisms, beginning with the simplest and moving up to the most complex, to understand how their organized parts may have developed, and learn how these parts work together to form whole living creatures. Whether plant or animal, all living things are made up of the same basic building blocks called cells, which are so small they usually cannot be seen without a microscope. One group of very simple water-dwelling life forms called the protozoa are made up of only one cell. Cells of protozoans, in fact all cells except those of very, very primitive life forms such as bacteria, are made up of two basic parts, a rounded nucleus and its surrounding material called cytoplasm. The nucleus is the place in the cell where instructions are stored. These instructions tell the cell how to reproduce, how to use food materials, and how to grow. When cells divide into two, the membrane layer around the nucleus disappears and chromosomes form. These microscopic worm-shaped structures contain the cell's instructions in their chemical codes, and as they duplicate themselves, will carry these instructions into the newly forming cells. If we look closely at the cytoplasm of cells using a very high-powered microscope, we can see that even this part of the cell is organized into many small parts, each of which performs a special function. When we look at the cytoplasm of even the simplest single-celled organisms, we can pick out two basic types of cells: those that have little green structures called chloroplasts, and those whose cytoplasm lack chloroplasts. Single cells that have chloroplasts are simple plants. Their chloroplasts trap sunlight and help convert water and carbon dioxide into sugar, which is a basic food. Single cells without chloroplasts are unable to make their own food and are simple animals. Many single-celled creatures, whether simple plants or simple animals, live alone, just swimming free in their watery worlds by wiggling special cell structures which help them move about. But quite a few creatures prefer not to live alone. Instead, they join together to form organized groups called colonies. Many of these colonies are truly amazing. Some can slide over one another as they snake through the water. Some form neat little hollow balls that can turn inside out. Others form long chains of thousands of individual cells. But the interesting thing about all of these colonies is that their individual cells communicate with each other, so that their activities become coordinated. They no longer try to swim in different directions, but move as a single organism. The very simplest animals that are made up of more than one cell, that is multicellular animals, are called sponges. Before the time of plastic sponges, the rubbery skeletons of these animals were used in many homes. Sponges are not simply colonies made up of only one type of cell. Instead, their bodies contain several different kinds of cells. Some are for trapping food, some for support, and others for reproduction. In multicellular organisms like the sponge, the different cells work together so the whole organism can perform tasks such as catching food better than single cells acting alone. Sponges can catch food really well because many cells work together to create a pump, sucking in water containing food particles, and pushing the water out once the food has been trapped by its body. As plants and animals become more complicated, the coordination between cells becomes very important. And to help accomplish this task, cells organize themselves into layers called tissues. This strange-looking animal, often found living in tide pools, is called the sea anemone. It is just one example of simple multicelled creatures that have tissue layers. Tissues are layers of similar kinds of cells working together to serve a common purpose. The sea anemone, like its freshwater relative the hydra, diagrammed here, has only two tissue layers. The first is the outer skin, or ectoderm. The second is the inner skin, or endoderm. The endoderm tissue surrounds the gut, and cells in this tissue layer are mostly involved with digesting food. The outer or ectodermal cells of both the hydra and sea anemone provide protection and also trap food. Some special cells develop between the two tissue layers. They can produce male or female sex cells, which can join together to make baby hydras or sea anemones. In most animals and plants, some tissue layers actually unite to form complicated devices called organs, which perform many important activities. For example, muscle, nerve, and connective tissue layers join together to form the chambers and valves of this tiny snail's beating heart. Most animals and plants have several organ systems that work together to keep them alive, help them grow, and produce new life. For example, many plants have colorful organ systems for reproduction called flowers, and delicate circulatory systems within their stems to bring food and water to their cells. The kind of work the organ systems do is usually pretty much the same from organism to organism. But the exact organs, tissues, and types of cells involved in creating these organ systems can be very different from one type of organism to the next. For example, the heart of a snail is quite different from the heart of a tadpole, even though the tiny cells that make up the tissues which unite to create an organ are always formed of the same basic parts, depending on whether they are found in plants or animals. Biologists who study how living things develop from single cells of fertilized eggs into fully grown organisms have noticed a very interesting fact. The development of complicated creatures seems to retrace the stages of change life has gone through on Earth. To understand this fact, let us follow a frog egg as it develops into a tadpole. Just as we saw when we first looked at simple single-celled animals and plants, the frog egg becomes more complicated as it goes from one cell to the clumps of the same kind of cell we saw happen in the cell colonies, to the large, more organized groups of a few types of cells like in the sponge, to a more organized ball with tissue layers similar to the hydra and sea anemone, until finally organs develop which then arrange themselves into organ systems, just as we saw in simpler many-celled animals like the snail. Fossils tell us that the history of life on Earth followed the same basic sequence carried out by the developing frog egg. The earliest life forms on our planet were simple one-celled creatures, and over billions of years, more and more complicated arrangements of cells led to the appearance of more and more complicated creatures as they adapted to ever-changing environments. Now we can see why living things are called organisms. All of life, from the simplest one-celled protozoans to the most complicated many-celled animals, is based on organization. And without this organization, there could be no life.